What's the darkest confession you've ever heard? My ex-boyfriend got drunk and admitted that he had taken advantage of every foster child his mom cared for. He showed no remorse at all. When I just stared at him, he gave this unsettling smirk and said, she had over 100 kids come through the house from the time she started taking them in. Many years ago, I dated a girl who was around 19 or 20, and I was 21. She had a young child, about 2 years old, and lived with her mother. One night, while I was driving her home after a date, she asked for my opinion on something that completely stunned me. Her mother was dating a man and wanted to have a baby with him, but she couldn't have more children. The boyfriend suggested that the daughter act as a surrogate. They had already asked her, and she had agreed. I asked if they were planning to go through in vitro fertilization. She told me they were planning to do it the old-fashioned way. I had to clarify it. So your mom's boyfriend wants things to happen naturally between all of you until you get pregnant, and everyone involved is okay with this, and you want to know if I'd stay with you after that? She said yes. I dropped her off and never spoke to her again. When I was 14, I was admitted to a psych ward for a 72-hour hold. The hospital was small, so they placed teens and younger kids together, meaning there were kids my age mixed with really little ones. There was a boy there who looked about 5. I felt bad for him. He was shy and nervous, and sometimes parents labeled their kids as problematic just to avoid taking care of them, so I wondered if he might be one of those cases. He was coloring in the main area, so I sat down next to him and gently asked if he knew why he was there. He took the lollipop out of his mouth and said, "I stabbed my sister in the eye with scissors," as casually as if he were commenting on the weather. I still think about that kid sometimes. I really hope he got the help he needed. I used to work in a mall, and there was a guy from another store who came in often. He was generally friendly, but he always gave me the ick. He was one of those, "where's my hug" types. One day, he told us a story in complete confidence about something that had happened the night before at a heavy metal show. He said he was in a mosh pit and kept bumping into a girl. He's well over 6 feet tall and pretty solid, and she eventually got fed up with him crashing into her. According to him, she lightly tapped the back of his head as a way of saying, "Stop doing that," and then moved away to keep moshing. For some reason, this bothered him so much that he pushed his way back toward her and intentionally swung his arm into her face while moshing. He ended up breaking her nose, and he was proud of it. He told the story like it was something impressive. Since she was bleeding and obviously hurt, she reported him to security, but because he had connections at the venue, he managed to get her thrown out and banned. I don't think I've ever been so shocked that someone would not only admit to something like that, but actually brag about it. Honestly, screw you, Dom. If you're enjoying these stories, don't forget to subscribe for more. It's a tie between a guy casually admitting he had beaten a rabbit to death with a shovel. I'm not even sure if it was true, but it was still an incredibly strange thing to claim so casually, and my abusive ex admitting that if she ever saw a stroller left unattended, she would take the child. She didn't use the word kidnap, but she framed it as if she'd be rescuing them. Edit: I know I brought this topic up, but it was in response to a post about the worst thing someone casually admitted. I'd really prefer not to read more stories about people harming animals, and the notifications keep coming in. Absolutely not something I ever wanted to hear. I really wish this hadn't been real, but back in the early 2010s, I became Facebook friends with a guy who was probably about 25 years older than me. He seemed like a chill person, great taste in music, self-aware, kind of had that cool uncle vibe. Out of nowhere, after we'd been friendly online for about a year, he messaged me and started asking about my high school dating life. Then he told me he was currently on some kind of drugs, he never said which, and on a hunting trip with another male friend. According to him, they were engaging in extremely inappropriate behavior with their dogs during that trip. I unfriended him immediately. Later, He reached out with a message saying, "Hey, man, sorry for being weird last week, I was pretty high." And just to be clear, this wasn't some anonymous stranger, he actually had a bit of recognition in his industry. I once worked with a nurse who had been born in Africa. She had noticeable scars on her arms and face, and during a night shift I gently asked her about them. She told me that, when she was a teenager, a group of men broke into her home at night and tied up her mother. She woke up to her mother screaming and realized they would likely come for her next. Thinking quickly, she spotted an empty Coke can, knocked it to the floor, stepped on it to fold it and create a sharp edge, and threw herself at the man she believed was the leader. They struggled for several minutes, and she ended up with a few scars, but in the chaos, she managed to injure him badly enough that he grabbed his neck and the rest of the group ran as soon as they saw what had happened. She never found out if he survived, and she genuinely didn't care. She was incredibly tough, but it definitely made for an unforgettable shift. I honestly can't blame her, given the situation. I was hanging out with one of my best friends at the time, playing video games and getting high. The news came on about someone being arrested for distributing CSA on Facebook. We were talking about how unbelievable it was that this guy thought, "You know who should see this awful crime I committed?" Everyone on my friends list. We were wondering whether he had filmed it himself or just had it on his phone when my friend suddenly said, "That's just stupid." Like, if I ever came across something like that, I'd probably check it just to see what it was, but to actually post it? You'd have to be out of your mind. I couldn't believe what I just heard. He didn't even try to correct himself. I remember feeling this tightness in my chest, like I couldn't breathe. I headed home not long after. I tried to tell myself he was just really out of it, but the way he shifted from joking around to saying something like that so clearly and calmly honestly scared me. My dad and I have always been fascinated by psychology, and at one point we went deep into reading about sociopaths. I remember him telling me there's one way to find out if someone is a sociopath: you simply ask them. I thought it sounded ridiculous, but I didn't dwell on it. Years later, I started seeing this guy who had me completely wrapped around his finger. He was well known in the area, practically had girls lining up for him, and everyone, guys and girls, wanted his attention. I was conflicted, because I wasn't a party person anymore. I was a young mom who had fun on my own time, but when my son was with me, I was in full mom mode. Meanwhile, this guy was all about partying, drugs, shady jobs, and general chaos. He showed me off everywhere, made it clear to other girls that I was his, told me I was inspiring him to get his life together, even bought my son things like a PlayStation without ever meeting him. He had me completely hooked, then would vanish for days, ghost me out of nowhere, and later reappear acting incredibly charming and convincing. After way too much emotional whiplash, I started looking into common traits of sociopaths. Then I remembered what my dad had told me years earlier. I tried to make it lighthearted, almost like a joke, and read the traits out loud to him, saying I was starting to think they described him. He laughed with me and said, "Yeah, and..." My stomach dropped. A part of me felt crushed, but another part finally felt clarity. It was the push I needed to cut him off. As heartbreaking as it was, that moment snapped me out of whatever spell he had over me, because I realized none of it had ever been real. To him, it was just a game. I once had a teacher, really just one of the football coaches who had no business teaching the class, who proudly told us a story from his college days. He said that he and his friends would catch cats and drop them from the top of the stadium just to see what would happen. He went into disturbing detail about the different outcomes, all while laughing like it was harmless teenage fun. I sat there in complete shock, and I think most of the class did too. I really wish I had reported it. I was young and naive at the time, and maybe nothing would have happened, but I still wish I'd tried. Maybe he would have at least been fired, and those poor animals would have had some kind of justice. He was unsettling in other ways too, like showing a little too much interest in some of the female students. Honestly, I regret even clicking into that thread. Thinking about him still makes my stomach turn. Many years ago, during a small party where we were drinking, we decided to play Never Have I Ever. You know the game, someone says, "Never have I ever," and if anyone has done it, they take a shot. One of my friends was there with her husband. It was her turn, and she said, "Never have I ever slept with my cousin," and then immediately took a shot of vodka. The entire room went silent, all of us just staring at her with our mouths open while she giggled. Her husband asked if she was actually being serious, and she said, "Yeah, it was cousin so-and-so. We used to sneak into each other's beds at family get-togethers." This cousin was our age, someone we all knew and had hung out with at different parties. Her husband completely lost it, got up, ran straight to the back fence, jumped over it, and disappeared into the night. The whole situation was surreal, a wild night that I still bring up whenever the opportunity presents itself. My ex told me, about 3 months into the relationship, by which point she had already moved in with me, that she had been in a 2-year relationship with her half-brother after both of her neglectful, alcoholic parents passed away. She was 18, legally an adult, and homeless, so she reached out to the only person she felt she could trust, her half-brother. It turned into an incestuous situation, and during that time he pushed her into stripping and sex work. She eventually tried to end her life. She survived, but it allowed her to get away from him. He had damaged her in more ways than I could count. She had spent time in psychiatric care several times in the years before I met her at a friend's gathering. She had this empathetic, disarming charm that I fell for, but I soon realized something felt off, and I ignored my instincts. She became extremely manipulative, love-bombed me hard, and shortly after sharing all of this with me, she took my money and left with our puppy. It took me at least a year to recover from everything. It's heartbreaking how much neglect and harm she suffered from the very people who should have protected her. I did manage to report the older half-brother to the police, and they told me he was already on their radar. Here's a very softened, clear, and respectful version that keeps only the essential idea of the story without repeating explicit or violent details. My brother used to constantly tell me he was going to hurt me. He would say it 2 or 3 times a day for years when we were teenagers. He'd go into long monologues explaining how and why, with details I won't repeat. It was so disturbing and strange that it was hard to believe someone could even come up with it. My parents allowed it because they insisted there was nothing they could do to stop him. He needed specialized psychiatric care his entire life, but they never took him anywhere that could truly help. If you've never lived with someone who genuinely needs to be institutionalized, as most people haven't, it's impossible to fully explain what it's like. It felt as if he had every possible mental health issue happening at once, non-stop. It never let up. Now that I'm an adult, what hurts the most is remembering all those constant threats I lived with for so many years. There was this hippie guy I knew from the skate park and a few other spots. Most of the time he was a really friendly, easygoing person, but whenever he got drunk and someone upset him, it was like he turned into a completely different person, genuinely frightening to be around. He had a young son and a pit mix named Jake, a sweet dog who wore sunglasses and a hat and was probably the first dog I ever saw ride a skateboard. One day, I ran into him at the skate park and he casually mentioned that he had taught his son a lesson. I didn't want to know what that meant, so I ignored it and kept smoking my cigarette. But he went on anyway, saying he was broke and hadn't been getting enough work to cover his bills. Then he told me he had taken his dog to the river and made his son shoot him, something about teaching the kid responsibility and that money doesn't grow on trees. His son was maybe 10 or 12. I realized he kept saying, "the dog," instead of Jake, and I didn't see his kid anywhere. So I asked him where his son was. He said, "Oh, he's at his mom's now. He's mad at me and whatever. At least now he knows about responsibility." I snapped. I tried to go after him. Jake was a great dog, basically one of the regulars we all saw at skate spots and house parties. Anyone would have helped take care of him. I'd even seen this guy steal groceries plenty of times. How could he not manage to get dog food? Suddenly everything clicked. He wasn't just flaky. He was genuinely unwell, someone completely lacking basic compassion. I didn't manage to hit him. I was bigger, but he was fast and kept moving out of reach. After that, we never spoke again except to yell at each other. Honestly, it's probably for the best. If I had caught him, I don't know what I would have done in that moment. Because aside from what he did to that dog, he traumatized his own kid for absolutely no reason. It still makes my blood boil, even though it happened a long time ago. For context, I live in the deep south in the US. I used to play tabletop games at a local game store, and there was another regular there, let's call him Petey, who was pretty much everyone's least favorite person to play against. He was that guy who insisted on the strictest interpretation of the rules whenever it helped him, but read everything as loosely as possible when it benefited him. On top of that, he was a loudmouth and generally obnoxious. He was originally from New England, and he was also the most casually racist person I knew. He'd make comments about not liking black people, except for a few he considered the good ones. Just awful remarks said casually, and this was in a city where the majority of the population is black. During the pandemic, I stopped going to the store regularly. A few years later, a new store opened, so I went to check it out, and who do I run into? Petey. I made polite small talk and noticed he was wearing one of those medical boots, so I asked what happened. He told me he was now a cop assigned to the local county jail. This isn't some tiny rural holding cell, our single jail usually houses around 1,000 inmates at a time. Then he explained that he had hurt his foot, kicking the crap out of an inmate who deserved it. According to him, the guy talked back, so Petey had to put him in his place. He went on to brag about how often he had to deal with inmates by force. Maybe he had encountered dangerous people, but he didn't talk about those situations. He only bragged about using force on inmates who, based on the way he described it, seemed to have done nothing more than be disrespectful or slow to respond. Eventually I pulled the classic, well, look at the time, and got out of there. And yeah, somehow, a guy who absolutely should not be in law enforcement ended up becoming a cop. A former partner contacted me 7 years after we broke up, and I found out she was now a mother. Everything seemed fine at first, until she told me that the father of her child hadn't wanted kids at the time, the usual reasons like financial concerns and not feeling ready. Then she told me that she had simply stopped using birth control and had, miraculously, become pregnant. I'll never forget the expression on her face when she said it. There was no emotion at all. My first thought was, she really needs professional help. Later, I found out that while she was talking to me, she was still in a relationship with the child's father. And what made things harder was that I eventually met the child and grew attached to him. I also learned that she had been unfaithful to her partner several times, even with exes, and had passed along an illness. If I met the child, it's likely others had met him in similar circumstances too. It was all very unsettling. Thankfully, I cut contact before getting pulled into that situation. All I hope now is that the child is doing well. When I worked at a psychiatric hospital, I did a night shift with a coworker who seemed friendly enough. Once all the patients had gone to sleep, he casually mentioned that he had spent time in jail for several different offenses. One thing he told me was a story involving a man who had harmed his daughter. He described taking matters into his own hands in a very extreme and unlawful way. It was disturbing how casually he said it. That was both the first and last shift I ever worked with him. He ended up getting fired for making inappropriate comments to patients. What still stays with me is how he even got hired in the first place. I'm fairly sure we all had to go through background checks, so I have no idea how he managed to get through the process. Then again, the hospital was often understaffed, so I wouldn't be shocked if they overlooked things just to have someone available to work. A person I know once said something that really worried me. They told me that, although they understood certain behaviors toward minors were wrong, they didn't fully understand why. They tried to justify their confusion by referring to historical examples and suggesting that modern social norms were what defined right and wrong. They even hinted that certain types of material should be allowed to prevent wrongdoing, without realizing how serious and harmful the implications of that idea were. I had to explain basic concepts like consent and ask very direct questions so they could grasp the seriousness of what they were saying. This person has noticeable difficulty with empathy, and I've seen behaviors from them that might not alarm most parents, but after that conversation, it became clear to me that they were thinking about things that are genuinely concerning. I don't know what to do. You can't report someone just for having troubling thoughts, but I also can't ignore the possibility that they might behave inappropriately if they don't get professional help. I'm genuinely unsettled by the whole situation. When I worked at a small local deli right after high school, I heard a lot of unsettling things from people around town. But there was one story I've never forgotten. There was a boy from the high school, maybe 14, whom I'll call Danny. He had a reputation for being aggressive, boastful, and trying to act tough to impress others. I honestly thought it was just typical teenage behavior. But during the summer, rumors began circulating about him. Some people said he wasn't treating his dog well, though no one said exactly what was going on. I assumed it must be something serious, but since it was all hearsay, I didn't comment on it. One day, Danny walked into the deli. Out of nowhere, without me asking anything, he made a completely inappropriate comment that hinted at something very troubling involving his pet. I froze. I didn't know what to say or how to react. My mind just couldn't process that a kid would say something like that so casually. I rang up his purchase, and he left. That was the last time I ever saw him. Later on, I found out the rumors had been real. Everything came to light because his grandmother discovered evidence in his room and took it to the police. It became a major scandal in our town. And strangely enough, while working at that deli, I heard many other stories just as odd. It felt like something dramatic happened almost every month. A high school friend once casually told me he suspected his dad might have been involved in very serious crimes, possibly even harming people. This friend had always been a bit rough around the edges and often in trouble, and his dad had a terrible reputation in our small town. One day we stopped by his house to pick something up, and I met his dad. I remember feeling an extremely unsettling vibe from him, something cold and empty that made me uncomfortable. When we got back in the car, my friend suddenly said, "You know that woman who went missing from the park about 20 years ago?" I said yes, because everyone knew the case. Then he added, very casually, "I'm pretty sure my dad was involved. And honestly, I think he's done similar things before, just never got caught." He said it like it was nothing, but it stayed with me for a long time. Eventually, I called the police because I couldn't stop thinking about it. The officer paused and said, "Yeah, we already know about him. We just don't have the evidence." They knew exactly who I meant. It still unsettles me to this day. When I was a young man, I spent some time in prison. There were some very unusual people there, including one man who was always calm, friendly, and cheerful, despite having taken the lives of 3 people for no clear reason. But the one person who truly made me feel uneasy was a younger inmate with unusual face tattoos and very pale skin, so people called him Powder. He came across as someone with no empathy at all. One day we were walking laps around the day room and talking, and he started bragging about the things he had done. He claimed that, shortly after September 11th, he had sent some of the threatening letters that made national news at the time. He spoke about it with an unsettling sense of pride, as if the harm caused didn't bother him in the slightest. You could tell something was very off. There was no remorse, no concern for anyone. I'm honestly grateful he ended up with a sentence of around 100 years with no chance of parole, because if he were out, I have no doubt he'd be extremely dangerous.